Just to introduce David before he takes over the stage, David Boud is Alfred Deakin Professor and Foundation Director of the Centre for Research in Assessment and Digital Learning at Deakin University, Australia. So we're delighted to have him with us this morning. He is also an Emeritus Professor at the University of Technology, Sydney, and Professor of Work and Learning at the Middlesex University. He's published extensively on teaching, learning and assessment in higher and professional education over many years, and his current work focuses on the areas of assessment for learning and in higher education, academic formation and workplace learning, and he is one of the most highly cited scholars internationally in the field of education with an H index of 94. So we are delighted that David has agreed to kick off the event for us. So I will hand over to you now, David.
Oh, thanks very much, Pam, for that introduction. I'm very pleased to be here. So greetings, or good evening, I should say, from Sydney. I'm very pleased to be invited to do one of these SEDA events. I was looking back and I have done one before, but that was nearly 30 years ago. So one of the things I can assure you now is that I'm not going to be repeating myself from then. So the things that I'll have to say will be, new from that period of time at least. One of the things I want to focus on is that we're at a very, very interesting point in time at the moment. We've had this COVID experience. Some of us are still having the COVID experience, and it has really produced some kind of disruption. Of course, that disruption varies quite a lot depending on who we are and where we are. But the question we've got at the moment is, as we're starting to come out of this, are we going to regress to the way things were before, or are we going to take the opportunity of having things all shook up to look at the agenda that we should have been pursuing before COVID? Is it going to shift it? Is it going to lock it in? What is it going to do? And that's what I want to focus on today. And I want to focus on that within the context of assessment. I'm just going to turn something off that's annoying me. Yes, I'm getting myself through a back channel here. Okay, so the focus is on assessment. I'm also going to try and work out how I can move my slides forward because they seem to be stuck. So if you just give me a moment. There we are. So what I want to focus on is this is the outline. I'm going to pause at a couple of points on the way through, and I'm going to turn to Pam, and Pam might bring forward some questions from the chat. I'll be unable to monitor that while I'm speaking, obviously. So at a couple of points on the way through, I'll turn to Pam to see whether there's a kind of a quick question we can ask midstream. But then at the end, we can open it up and you can put your hand up and do things in that way to open up discussion. So I want to focus on the basic issue that has concerned us for a long time. What is the problem of assessment? Why is it bugging us? Why is it something that continually, when we review students, when we ask them for their evaluations of courses, assessment and feedback comes at the top time and time and time again. Some people have come up with some clever technical reasons why that might be the case, but I suspect there is a real issue of substance that we need to deal with. I then want to turn quite briefly to the troubling effects of COVID-19 on higher education and what that might have loosened up, might not have loosened it up, and then go back to the basics of what assessment needs to do and what its core purposes are. And the three core purposes I want to focus on and elaborate on some of the issues within them is assessment to assure outcomes, assessment to enable learning, and assessment to develop students' evaluative judgment. And I want to end on the issue of how do we actually balance these different purposes, because we can do each one of those very well on their own. It's doing all three of them across a course, which is the big challenge for us. So what is the problem? So I've already suggested that the assessment needs to satisfy many purposes, but it doesn't do any of them very well. Assessment also reflects poorly the kinds of tasks that students will be engaged in the world of practice. I'm not talking here about immediate employability. I'm talking about things that people do in the world and whether the things that people do in the world are reflected in the kind of things we want students to do when we assess them in higher education. And when we look at that, when we do the kind of curriculum analysis, which we do from time to time, curriculum mapping, what we find time after time after time, we assess some learning outcomes massively, excessively, really over the top, and others hardly at all. And it doesn't help students with what they have yet to learn. So we've still got a notion of assessment as very much a backward-looking activity. And one of the things I want to put on the agenda today is how we need to look at assessment in terms of what it does for the future. And in particular, one of the things it doesn't help students to do very well is help them judge their own performance, which I want to argue later is one of the absolutely overwhelmingly important needs for outcomes of higher education. So this is just kind of a very, very quick run through of all the things you know already, just to remind us all. What impact does this assessment have? It has multiple impacts. The one thing it's not short of is impact. The question is, impacts we desire. So assessment gives a message to students about what we value. That's the simple equation that students make. So if your assessments are a perfect representation of what is important in your course, then we're really doing the right thing. It very easily, enormously easily encourages rote learning, and it discourages deep approaches to learning. It very much, some of the assessment practices we've engaged in for decades and decades, you might even argue centuries, encourages students to learn lots of stuff and not to engage deeply with that stuff. The other thing we know from our own experience is that it very poorly distributes student study time across the semester. There's an assessment task, study goes up, assessment task finishes, study activity goes down. And we can actually map the amount of time students spend on learning according to where the assessment tasks are distributed. We also know, despite it being one of our learning outcomes, that students should be able to work effectively with each other, much assessment inhibits cooperation and collaboration between students. We also know that it overemphasizes some skills like handwriting for hour after hour. How many people in the real world now engage in handwriting hour after hour after hour? They don't do that. They work on screens, they work on keyboards. And they do a lot more communicating verbally, which is not a very high proportion of what we do in assessment. And of course, the big thing of all, the elephant in the room, is that assessment often distracts students from the object of study through a focus on marks and grades and not on what it is that they should be learning. They ask us questions about how do I get a better mark? I refuse to answer that question. If they want to ask me the question, how can I be more effective in studying this area? I'm very happy to engage with that. So let's just have this little excursion into COVID. So what happened? Almost overnight, well, it probably lasted a couple of weeks, the immediate transition, there's a rapid move to emergency remote teaching, emergency remote assessing, emergency remote feedback. Face-to-face assessments, particularly exams, couldn't be held at all. All communication was digital. Students were, I'm not saying at home, they were somewhere isolated from us and isolated from each other. Conventional, unseen, closed book, time-limited, invigilated exams were modified. They couldn't take place, and therefore we either had to have a technical fix, and a whole lot of technical fixes came along, or they were massively changed, so they didn't actually meet some of these requirements listed here. We used a whole lot of other forms of assessment, and some, I mean, I don't know where these universities were. Well, I know exactly where some of them were. They actually deemed that students had passed the assessment when they hadn't done anything at all. And of course, some institutions and some students cope far better than others. So where does this, the COVID experience leave us? Well, it leaves us questioning, why do we have such an excessive emphasis on unseen, closed book, time-limited, invigilated exams? Now, I've listed all those elements there because it's perfectly possible to have an exam that isn't unseen or closed book or time limited or invigilated. So why is it that we put this whole bunch of things together? Why have we fetishized a particular form of examination? Examinations don't have to be like that. So why are we absolutely focused on it? It doesn't protect against cheating. We know full well that substitution occurs. Students other than the student whose name is on the paper take examinations for other students. We also know that the absence of keyboarding and screens distorts the way students work. We also know that a lot of the things we put in examinations are unrealistic problems. We also know that in the real world, students have access to resources. They have things like mobile phones, they have access to the internet, and they have all those things like that, which for some reason or another, we think isn't appropriate for many of the assessments that we do. I'm not saying this is universal, but I still think there's a domination of examinations of this particular kind. Some of us move to remote proctored exams, and this solved some problems, but one with a considerable cost and two with a considerable downside. Students didn't like the level of surveillance that was involved. They thought we were intruding into their personal world, and we did. So I think we may need continuing a few high stakes externally mandated purposes that use remote proctored exams in the future when we can't get students together. But we need to question that. And the issue, as far as integrity is concerned, is the issue is managing risks, not pretending those risks can be eliminated. And of course, the great thing we recognized, some people had already recognized this, of course, electronic communications, electronic submissions, electronic feedback, and so on and so forth is normal and needed. It's not a substitution for other things. We still need to do other things as well, but we need to have great facility, great sophistication in using these things in a particularly in an asynchronous way. And of course, there are new modes of relating with tutors, peers, and so on. New modes of feedback can be enabled through these means. So that's my quick, few minutes take on COVID. But let's go back to the core business of assessment. What does assessment need to do? I want to suggest that it needs to do three things, three key purposes, and none of them are negotiable. First of all, it needs to assure that learning outcomes have been met. We claim that our courses enable students to do things. Have they or have they not been successful in doing that? Can we actually certify that our students can do the things that our courses claim they will be able to do? That's assurance, certification, summative assessment. We also need to use assessment to enable students to actually reach the state whereby their learning can be assured. We need to provide them with guidance and assistance and resources on the way through. So there's a formative purpose for assessment, which is an enabling purpose. It's enabling them to actually meet, ultimately, the learning outcomes. And it's tailoring the things they need for that purpose. And the third purpose, the core purpose I want to argue, it is about building students' capacity to judge their own learning. Our students are completely and totally dysfunctional if it's only us that can judge the quality of their work at the point of graduation. Unless they can do it for themselves, then they can't operate doing anything in the world. They need an understanding of what they can do and what they can't do. And we need to think about that as a core purpose of our courses. And assessment has a very important role to play in that. So what I want to do is to take each one of these key purposes and have a bit of a look at them. So let's look at assurance. So let's start with the learning outcomes and assurance. So learning outcomes are public statements of what's needed for a student to complete a course. The UK was quite early in having the subject benchmark statements, and those ideas have been taken up by the QAA, and they've been taken up by all sorts of other qualifying authorities in Ireland, in other countries, as the discourse that we use. This is the language we use to describe what students will be able to do in their courses. And it's a representation and a manifestation in these outcomes of what the academic standards are that we hope our students will meet. And these learning outcomes are specified at both the program level overall and at the course unit level. And of course, they have to be nested nicely within each other. And of course, what we find with curriculum mapping is that there are all sorts of discontinuities between what the course claims, what the program claims, and what individual course units might do. And of course, they have serious consequences. If we state them, we must assure them, and we must take them seriously. And just by way of illustration here, why is my screen frozen? Okay, by way of illustration here, this is where we've reached in Australia. So we have a higher education standards framework. We have a TEXA, which is, it's like your QAA, but with legislative teeth, that all higher education institutions have to be. In order to do that, we have to meet the higher education standards framework. I just pulled out here what it says about learning outcomes and assessment. Some of it is quite straightforward. The expected learning outcomes for each course of study are specified, consistent with the level and field of education of the qualification awarded, and informed by national and international comparators. Okay, no big deal. That's not an issue. It starts to bite in the next paragraph. Methods of assessment are consistent with the learning outcomes being assessed. Well, that's fair enough. We wouldn't want them to be inconsistent. And they are capable of confirming that. That is, if you make a claim for a learning outcome, if you say you enroll in this course and this is the outcome, you have to be prepared to assure that. And this is the big sleeper in assessment for assurance. We need to look very carefully at what we're claiming students will be able to do, and does the assessment provide a persuasive way of saying to the world that this is what's happening. So what is the assessment then in the context of learning outcomes? Well, assessment is, this is the assessment for assurance, is all about judging whether students can demonstrate attainment of learning outcomes to a given standard. That means we must establish transparent standards for all assessment tasks. Not the exams, not the final one, all assessment tasks that count towards assurance. Setting a pass mark is not setting a standard. It's just a norm. Setting a general set of standards for courses or units is not enough. We can't roll them out. We can't roll out the standard set. across completely different subject matter, different kinds of outcomes we're trying to achieve. And we can't use the sort of weasel words like good, superior, excellent, inadequate, whatever. They don't indicate a standard or communicator level. And the real sleeper here is marks are not a substitute for standards. And that means under a standards-based learning outcomes framework that we are all supposed to be working within, good marks on one outcome don't compensate for inadequate marks on others. So when we're talking about assuring a standard, it means that all students have to meet the minimum threshold level. They can't do better on something else and get extra marks and compensate. That's not how learning outcomes work. And it means that all assessment must be standards-based. We talk now about things being standards-based, not criterion referenced. And the idea of norm referencing, that is, we judge students one against another, which is often what we do when we talk about setting pass marks, is prohibited. It's not undesirable. It's not, we don't really, we'd prefer you do something else. It is prohibited, it is banned. It should be taboo. But I can guarantee you I can walk into any university almost anywhere in the world and find residues of norm referencing all over the place. So what else drives us? Well, this is an old quote, but I think this quote still applies today. And the cartoon, in a sense, illustrates some aspects. So many students perceive traditional assessment tasks as arbitrary and irrelevant. It did not make for effective learning because they only aim to learn for the purposes of the particular assessment with no intention of maintaining the knowledge for longer term. A lot of our assessment is approached by students with no expectation that anything should stick after they've completed the assessment. Too often we set things up that way. And part of that is one of the motivations that there's been in this move towards what's being called authentic assessment. So authentic assessment has been rather fashionable. So I'm kind of feeling a bit kind of awkward about mentioning it again. But I think there's some aspects of it worth focusing on. So what problem was authentic assessment created to address? Well, one of the big ones was that students don't see the point of what they're learning. In particular, they don't see the point of what they're learning for the assessment activity. They don't see it as to be meaningful. Often they say that courses are insufficiently aligned to the world of practice. They often see that program level learning outcomes are ignored at the expense of favourite subject matter of individual staff members. And they think that assessments are uninteresting to take. And of course, we often find them boring to mark. So what is this authentic assessment? Well, it's a bit of a rolling definition here because it's sort of shifting over time. So I picked up a number of different features here. So we've got realism, that authentic tasks are tasks that are linked with everyday life and work. They are contextualized, and that means knowledge is applied in a particular context. It is not disengaged from a context. Problematization concerns. Students can see that what's learned can be used to solve a problem or meet a need. We see a sense of challenge, that it's not a simple application of existing knowledge. It's certainly not a reproduction of existing knowledge. It's the use of existing knowledge to do something worthwhile. And often authentic assessment tasks have social value, and that is the task addresses something that matters in the world. Now, not all authentic assessment tasks can deal with something that matters in the world, but students need to see that they could be doing that. And they need to see that assessment tasks are not free-floating, as it were. Those of you who haven't seen Jan MacArthur's kind of recent critique of authentic assessment and an argument for a new take on authentic assessment is well worth reading her latest paper in Journal Higher Education. So one of the key authentic features, and this is one of the ways of judging whether something is authentic or not, is that they're directed to some purpose beyond the exercise itself. So when students look at it, they don't think, oh, this is just an exercise. Nobody would do this anywhere other than in a university or in an educational institution of any kind. So the existence of an authentic audience. So who is the audience? What is the authentic audience? Aids construction of an authentic task. And of course, authentic tasks often involve working with others. We might act as a surrogate for the real audience, but the task makes it clear that there is a real audience, even if we're the substitute. And of course, increasingly, colleagues are developing sophisticated tasks that need real external audiences to appreciate them. So there are a number of examples around in which students undertake tasks on the web and they get crowdsourced assessment and feedback on them. People that they don't know, people that we don't know, actually contribute to the assessment. We need to moderate that, of course, but that is one dimension of authenticity. Now, of course, authentic isn't an absolute. And in fact, some tasks in the world are so complicated, we couldn't possibly use them as assessment tasks. So in one sense, they do have to be cleaned up for use as an assessment activity. So what we're looking at here is moving in an authentic direction. And it's not simply taking a task from the external world. Students need to feel that it's authentic and has value for them. And some tasks might have more value to the students than they have for some external audience. But it does focus attention on the artifacts that students produce. Are they producing the kind of artifacts that a practitioner might produce? Not in the workplace, in the community, wherever someone practices. And every graduate practices, whether they practice what they've graduated in or not. How can they meet a real need? How can they better reflect what practitioners do? Are there ways of organising real-world responses? So I'm just going to pause to catch breath here and just check with Pam to see whether there are any immediate questions that have come up that she wants to put. And it's okay for there to be one or two or none. So Pam.
Yeah, thanks, David. I mean, there's some really great comments coming down in the chat about people being fascinated that higher education continues to use exams when further education doesn't use them as much. There's comments about the prevalence of myths and lack of confidence to change. There is a question about, if standards-based, does this mean it should be pass-fail? And if not, what wording would be appropriate to identify how well a student does?
Well, the thing that we've got to get in our heads, I think, in a standards-based approach is, what is the threshold standard? What is the standard below which the student has not met the requirements? So that is fail, however you call it. It's not 40%, it's not 30%, it's fail. So there's a threshold we need to think about. And when we're in these examiners meetings, we need to think a lot more carefully about what the threshold is and less about what this strange thing is called the pass mark, because we can always fix the pass mark, but we need to think very carefully about what that standard is and have some consistency about that. All that a standards-based approach says is that you must make sure that students have met the standard. Now, of course, as higher education institutions, we want most of our students to achieve a lot more than the minimum standard. So that is the way that grades fit in and high-level achievements fit in, so that we have to meet the standard, but we also can recognise students that go beyond the standard. But we need to put a lot more attention on this threshold and probably a little bit less attention on the kind of the minutiae of some of the grade boundaries.
Great, thanks, David. A couple of other comments are about professional bodies often being the people who are keeping the focus on traditional assessment, particularly exams. And then there's a comment here about, with all the information that we have, why do academic developers mostly fail to persuade higher education colleagues to make these changes? And sometimes it is about people, not being able to make the change, and what can we do to do more around that?
Quick comment about professional bodies is that I'd like to see the real professions represented in the professional bodies and not just academics from other universities, because a lot of these professional bodies that are constraining us to do inappropriately old ideas are our colleagues from other institutions. They're not real members of the profession. They might have practiced it some time ago, but they're not current. So one of the real experiences of COVID was the experience that we had of all universities in Australia going along to professional bodies and saying, well, we've got this problem. We can't do the traditional exams, And by and large, the professional bodies were quite accommodating. And some of them said, well, we weren't quite sure why you were doing it that way anyway. So let's not put the blame somewhere else. Let's actually take responsibility for convincing professional bodies. Now, don't get me wrong, there are circumstances in which they do need to exert some external influence on us. But by and large, it's not so much of an external influence, it's just a displaced internal influence, I suspect. Maybe I'll move on now. So we're going back to the three purposes. So let's have a look at the one in the middle. This is about enabling students to use information to aid their learning now, the formative assessment one. So big feature under that heading of formative assessment is feedback. And there's been a bit of a revolution going on in the world of feedback, which many of you will be very familiar with, but it still hasn't quite get through. We have a conception of feedback that is locked into things like the National Student Survey and the equivalent national surveys in other countries, that locks in a teacher-centered view of feedback, that focuses on feedback in terms of what teachers do. And the revolution that's been occurring is to move from this teacher-centered notion of feedback, in which we're the only people to blame. If feedback doesn't work, it's because we haven't given them the appropriate input, towards a learning-centric view of feedback, which means that unless inputs from others lead to worthwhile effects, feedback has not occurred. It's not just inadequate feedback. Feedback hasn't occurred unless there is some influence on what students do. Otherwise, it's just hopefully useful information. It's hanging data, which is hanging there with nowhere to go. Now, a number of us had a big national project in Australia a few years ago, in which we took two very large Australian universities, and we tried to make sense of what constituted really, really high quality feedback in those institutions. And two things I want to pick up from that. The first one was, before we started this project, we went to the literature and we looked at definitions of feedback, and we were horrified. We were horrified. We didn't find a single definition that we could even adapt that made sense. They were all, in that sense that I've just described it, teacher-centric views. So we came up with this definition. Feedback is a process. Feedback is not just an input. Feedback is a process over time. It's a process in which learners make sense of information. Information comes from other places, comes from other people, it comes from other sources, human and non-human. But learners have to make sense of it, otherwise it's not feedback. And it's about the student's performance, so it's tailored towards them. It's about their particular work. It's not just study in general. Students do something and they get They engage with processes to focus on that, and they use it to enhance, looking forward towards enhancing the quality of their work or their learning strategies. And of course, what this definition does is it shifts feedback away from this one point of time that we've become obsessed with institutionally towards thinking about it. How does it work over time? How can we engage students more effectively in that whole process? And of course, this is not feedback. Now, unfortunately, I'm going to have to get rid of this slide because in the electronically enabled assignment world that we now live in, we don't get these piles of return scripts in departmental offices anymore. We actually have something which enables us to track whether students are actually engaged with some of the things that we provide. So how do we build feedback processes, not just feedback inputs, feedback processes into courses? The thing I think we need to think of is, what is our key role? What is our central role? What is the role of the person that has responsibility for a course unit? Well, I think one of them is to design and manage feedback processes, not to generate all the comments that students might need. So we need to ask ourselves on how many occasions of feedback are needed in each course. Where are students stimulated? Where do they get the inputs? And have we organised them in such a way that students are enabled to meet the threshold learning outcomes? So students get feedback, or they get feedback information of various kinds in order that they should actually do better. So how are we going to arrange that? What processes do we need for that? When will they occur? Now, conventionally, they occur only on graded assignments or at the end of a course. We need to think about feedback activities that aren't immediately associated with grades, things we do in the class, things we do online, as well as graded assessments. And we need to think about who will provide inputs to students. There's ourselves, there's tutors, there's students' peers, there's practitioners, there's technology. There are others. Students need to be invited to self-feedback through a whole range of different ways, which I think David Nichols here will be pleased for me to say that, because that's often underestimated. So that's one thing from our project. The other thing of the project was seeking out good examples. And we got a small response rate. We only got 4,500 responses. And we asked students, tell us which course units are the course units in which you had the very, very best feedback experiences in your time here so far. What we did is we made a big list of these and looked at the ones at the top of the list, ones that many, many students were nominating as really good feedback examples. We then went in and did case studies of them. We interviewed students, we interviewed staff, we captured them on video, and we actually constructed some case studies, which are available on this website here. The URL is feedbackforlearning.org, and you can actually go in and see what we came up with there. The case studies aren't just simply the ones at the top of the list. We loaded them in terms of difficulty. So we included examples from first year, because first year is very challenging, and we included examples with large classes. And when we talk about large classes in Australia, we're talking about 1,000 students plus. You know? A class with a few hundred students, well, if you can do it with 1,500, you can certainly do it with 2. And what we have here is this resource that you can look at. I'm not going to spend any more time. We've got these case studies are available to look at. Don't worry about the subject matter. If the subject matter is not yours, put that aside. What's interesting about all of these is the strategies that people use to take a given circumstance, take no more resources to do it within existing constraints, and come up with the most creative and interesting solutions. Now, the other big thing that's occurring in the feedback world right now is a proliferation, a flourishing, as it were, of alternatives to written comments. So we've got many modes. So the group comments. The group comments is where, you know, you just provide some feedback to students, feedback information to students as a collective. Like you say, well, a lot of people have problems with this kind of issue, you know, and then talk about that issue. Well, it might be very good in terms of the overall teaching in a particular unit, but basically students don't see them as feedback. And you're not going to convince people just by using the word feedback, that they're about feedback at all. So there is an issue there about those activities, very worthwhile, but they're not a substitute for things which are more personalized. There's the whole issue of face-to-face by appointment, office hours, and everybody makes a big fuss about office hours. But there's a really, really, really serious problem with that. And the serious problem is that the students who least need your help are the ones most likely to approach you. It's been found in many, many studies, and a whole lot of personal experience people have had, is that the students that are struggling don't come along and talk to you. So we really need processes that aren't dependent upon students being so confident that they're willing to engage with you about issues that they're facing in their work. Big thing that's coming up is video or audio comments, and we've got some examples of that in our case studies that I mentioned before. And the idea is really, really simple. You sit in front of your laptop and you look at your webcam in exactly the same way that I'm doing now, and you talk to your screen as if it is the person, the student you're talking to. You've got their work in front of you, and then you have a discussion with them. Now, it's a one-way discussion, but it works much better if you talk as if you're having a discussion. So you thank them for their work, you address them by name, you say, I noticed this about your work, I really like what you did there, there are these issues here that I noticed. And what you can do in that mode, whether it is video or audio, students slightly prefer video. What you can do there is you can give much greater nuance, much greater emphasis. You can give cues in a much more effective way than writing out every single issue. But the thing that's really sold this on a lot of people is it takes less time than writing out written feedback. So students get higher quality feedback, more focused feedback, they experience it as more personal, and it saves you time. And the variation on that is for technical subjects, visual subjects, subjects that have images, subjects that have equations, and that's what the image is here on the screen, screencast plus audio comments, so that the work of the student comes up on the screen and you can annotate it, you can point to things, you can say, well, if we took off this part of the molecule there and put it there, then you would have a very different function, or whatever it is that you're explaining. That looks like a some kind of organic chemistry there, but you can do it with almost anything if you need the visual part of the content. And of course, it's almost impossible to do that just through annotating a piece of paper and then sending it off. So some key points about feedback and this purpose of assessment. Feedback's one of the very few ways in which courses are tailored to the individual needs of students. For very, very good equity reasons, we make sure that students have the same resources, they have the same outcomes they're working towards, they have the same assessment tasks, we use the same criteria, we design everything to be very fair to them. One big problem: students are not identical to each other. So we do need also mechanisms in courses in which we recognize that students are different and have different needs that need to be met. And the feedback process is one of the ways of dealing with that. We also need to think about how we need to carefully design them, and providing comments to students is only one part of any feedback process. Mostly you need some input to students, but it might be an input that you get them to seek rather than you provide. And of course, without active engagement from students, feedback can't influence learning. Let's say that again. Unless the students are actively engaged in doing something with information, no learning happens. No influence, no impact, no effect. So we need to think about feedback as, how do we do things that maximize effect? How do we complete the feedback loop? So, final thing about feedback, it should always be judged in terms of its effect on student learning. Not on the input, but on the effect. Now, of course, that's a technically difficult process. We can't necessarily attribute a particular outcome, a particular effect on a particular input, but we can look for signs. And that's one thing that we need to think about very carefully. Are we providing subsequent activities in our course units that enable us to get some indication that students have actually utilised feedback at an earlier stage? And finally, on this particular purpose, let's have an important distinction here that Naomi Winston and I were exploring a little while ago. We're arguing that we need to make a very important distinction when we're looking at assessed work. So there are judgments that we make about students' work for assurance purposes. Has this work met the criteria? Has it met the standards? If we're using a rubric, how does it actually address the standards and levels in the rubric? That is what we're calling mark justification. And a mark comes out of that, and we say, well, you have this mark for these reasons, and we can look at these reasons why you get that mark. That, in our argument, is not a feedback input. It has some helpful features, of course, but it's not feedback information. Feedback information on a student's assignment is not looking backwards to what they have done, but helping students look forward to what they can do. So feedback information is about comments about what students can do to improve their work. How can they better meet the learning outcomes? How can they meet a learning outcome which they haven't met so far? So feedback information looks forward. Mark justification looks back. When it's graded work, we need both. But let's be clear that students getting a fair shake of the sauce bottle, as one of our previous prime ministers said. They need to know why they've achieved something in that work, but also they need to know how they can go forward. Looking back, looking forward, very important distinction. Oh, just a little adverts while I refresh my throat. I want to follow up on feedback. There's some books that you can look at. And how are we going for time? Oh, we've got time for a quick question. And any quick things on the way through, Pam?
There are quite a lot of comments in relation to the feedback that you've got there. So there's comments about feedback being an area of potential that's been unrealised. People are upbeat about feedback being designed into courses. Many people have already used video and audio, but also some people have talked about how they've given feedback to cohorts, as a cohort giving them feedback before they get their individual feedback. Comments about scalability in relation to giving video and audio feedback, and someone's talked about how they've now added an appendix to assessments for students, talk about how their previous feedback has helped them develop their particular assessment they're handing in now. Yeah,
talking about scalability, if you want to look at scalability, look at the second case study on that website that I mentioned to you. That's using audio feedback with a cohort of 1,500 students taught each year on 4 different campuses and taught online at the same time with 30 different tutors. Okay. Really high quality feedback inputs in that context, in which the quality of the feedback is moderated by the person responsible. So that's a spectacular example there. And there are Jacqueline Broadbent, who led that, has done a whole lot of, she's written other things about the remarkable things she's been doing with very, very large classes. Okay, let's go back to the third purpose, which is about building students' capacity to judge their own learning. And this is in what you might call sustainable assessment. We've had summative assessment, formative assessment. This is sustainable assessment. So this is the dilemma. If students can't judge the quality of their own work, how can they learn effectively? How do they know what to do? No? There isn't somebody there all the time saying, well, you've got to do this, you've got to do that, you've got to do that. Well, that's not realistic. The world doesn't work like that. Students have actually got to be able to make those decisions for themselves. If graduates can't judge the quality of their own work, how can they practice effectively? How can they do the simplest thing in the workplace? And if students or graduates can't help each other judge the quality of their work, how can they work effectively with each other? Because there's an issue of trust, you know. If somebody says they're doing something, you've got to trust them that they're doing something to the level that's acceptable. So this whole issue of making evaluative judgments is fundamental to education, life, and work. And as Deakin talked about it, if you can't describe what you're doing as a process, you don't know what you're doing. So this is the challenge. It's like, how do we actually help students to articulate what they can and cannot do, what they do and do not know? This is not a one-off thing. This is something that we do every day, all the time. And we need to help students practice it. So the problem of all work is, if we're confronted with a new challenge and we're happy having this every single day, how do we know if we're doing it well or not? And these are some of the things that people suggest. Well, you look for examples of good work of a similar type. We ask our peers or co-workers. We identify the basis on which we'll be judged. Is there a protocol for it? Is there a contract for it? Is there a specification for it? We show samples to others. We say, oh, hang on, have a look at this. Does this meet the needs? And so on and so forth. We consult documentation, ask experts. I put exclamation marks at the final one here, ask one's line manager, because the studies that have been done about learning in the workplace suggest that that's probably the last person that gets asked. And the reason it's the last person that gets asked is because in the workplace, we need to portray ourselves as a competent worker. Why would we reveal our deficiencies to someone that has the power to hire or fire us? They're the last person that should know about that. So we will talk to anyone else in the organization, our peers, someone in another division, et cetera, other than the person that we're directly managed by. So if that occurs in the workplace, there's an interesting question about the extent to which students are willing to reveal this to their teachers in educational institutions. We don't have examples of studies on that, but it's suggestive. So what is evaluative judgment? We define it as the capacity to make informed decisions about the quality of the work of oneself and of others. So is this work good enough, both our own work and other people's work? And you might say, well, hang on. Don't we do this already? Isn't that what university courses are about? And in one sense, yes. But often it's not an explicit focus. We're not explicit, we're not upfront about it. It's really a systematic process, focus in which we do it consistently over course units over time. And it often gets distracted by the fragmentation of the curriculum, model placement, students moving around, et cetera. And many of our conventional assessment practices inhibit it. They give students the message that we're the people that know, we're the people that judge. Don't you worry about that. We're going to tell you what your mark is, right? So why are we not, as a matter of course, asking students themselves to make a judgment about their own work before they hand it in? Why are we not, for example, then providing helpful information to them when their judgment is wrong? Why are we not doing it to help calibrate their judgment? So when we discussed that in that book that I have the image of there, we talked about several integral components of evaluative judgment. Two key ones: understanding notions of quality. What does a quality thing look like? Unless a student has a notion of what good is, or what a good one of the thing that they're doing is, how can they possibly produce a good one of that thing? So understanding notions of quality and making comparisons. Is my work meet the standard of this yardstick that I'm comparing myself to? Does it come up to this standard? Does it meet this criteria? How does it relate to this exemplar? So they're the kind of questions we need to be focusing on here. And these are some of the activities around evaluative judgment, around these two key notions that we can engage students in. And none of these are new. None of these are things that we haven't done before. But the issue is framing it around this particular purpose of developing the capacity of students to make judgments about their own work. Now, I'm not going to linger on this and go through all these bits, but you can get a sense of the kind of things students might be engaged in. Another way of looking at it is that we need to build it into curriculum design, and we need to build it in both to the teaching and learning activities and to the assessment tasks. This isn't something that assessment alone carries the burden of. This is something we need to do throughout everything that we do. What's not likely to be effective? One-off interventions in individual course units. We know that from all the studies that have been done on self-assessment. Huge number of examples in the literature of doing a nice little self-assessment exercise. Students find it worthwhile. Staff think it's a good thing to do. Does it add up to anything? No, not much. Unless we do it systematically over time, these things aren't effective. Practice without feedback on the effectiveness of judgments isn't enough. So it's not a matter of information about the correctness of the task. It's information about discrepancies in the judgment between the student of their work and someone else about their work. It's not likely to be effective if we assume there's necessary knowledge transfer from one domain to another. Doing evaluative judgment in one area works in that area. Maybe a bit of transferability, but we need to actually not make the assumption that it necessarily transfers. And the other thing that isn't going to be effective is waiting till students know more advanced, more mature, and so on. This is something we need to start right from the start, because students need to be thinking proactively about developing their judgments. They need to be thinking proactively about where they seek information from, who they seek information from, where they seek it, how they use it, how do they actually deploy other people around them to help them refine their capacity to make judgments of their work. Just see the time. Very quick example here. So this is an example I've used in my own teaching. Before starting the assignment, we have a little activity to identify the features of what the assignment being done well might look like. What would a really good example of this look like? Students actually generate a whole lot of suggestions, which I then introduce the notion of criteria to them. And these are criteria for making judgments. Then gets put on an assignment attachment sheet. So there's this list of features down one side, and then students write in the extent to which their own assignment matches these requirements that they've identified for themselves in their own language. Students can get input from peers before they submit. They record how well their assignment addresses the agreed criteria, and they hand that in along with the assignment. And following submission, they get feedback information from the teacher, which focuses not on what they've done well and not done well. The students themselves have already done that. What it focuses on is where there's the difference, the discrepancy between the student's judgment of the quality of their work and the judgment of the teacher. That's the thing where the students need help to move forward on. And of course, students can then construct an action plan about areas needing development and where that plan is going to land in what kind of future activities in the unit. So these are some of the features of it. Students engage with criteria and standards ahead of generating work. So they don't see, these lists as kind of completely artificial. They've been involved in generating themselves. Students get inputs from others about their actual work. They show their actual work to other people. They calibrate their judgments against those of others, both peers and teachers. A response to the comments is expected. So the end of the assignment is not the handing in of it. The end of the assignment is them making a plan for what happens next. And future assignments enable students feedback information to be used in the future. So they're the three areas that we looked at. And the final few slides is the balance. So we need to think about this in a temporal way. There's a time dimension to this. When we're looking at assessment for assurance, what we're doing is that we're assuring the world that students have met certain standards. So why should a student be penalised for not doing something very well in first semester and first year, when by the time they graduate, they're an expert in that area? So we need to think very carefully about where assurance kicks in. And by and large, assessment for assurance occurs later rather than earlier. And we should be very careful we don't trap students in their early learning, but what they have managed to do to come up with. So assessment for assurance is loaded towards the end. Assessment to enable learning is loaded in exactly the opposite way. By the end of semester, by the end of the course, it is too late. Right? The opportunities for students to pursue it, unless it's an unbelievably well integrated course, and most courses aren't unbelievably well integrated, then it needs to occur during the time period of the course unit, which means it needs to be loaded towards the first part of the semester rather than the last part of the semester. So for assurance, it's late. Assessment for assurance is late. Assessment to enable learning is early. And of course, assessment to build students' capacity to make effective judgment is needed all the way through. All the way through. So, final slide. What then, going back to the title, and I've picked here, what is the new focus for assessment? Well, I think we need to make the most of changes from the pandemic, which means reducing inappropriate end of course exams and redesigning tasks. At Deakin, I just found that this year, compared with 2019, pre-pandemic, we are only providing 1/6 of the number of formal examinations that we did in 2019. We've managed to redesign many of those to a whole range of other tasks. And with some of those tasks are exams in a new form. Open book, open access, students have resources, they're longer periods, etc., etc. Students can use screens, etc. We need to design assessment deliberately to have a continuing positive influence on student learning. We must always judge students' assessment in terms of its consequential effect. And that's the one idea that I'm picking up from the last time I talked to SEDA, the importance of consequential validity for assessment. They need to be better equipped for the future after having undertaken an assessment they did before. Assessment is not a non-intrusive measure. It has an effect. So let's actually maximize the positive nature of that effect. In outcomes-based world, students must be comfortable in using standards and criteria for themselves and with each other. So this is not secret teachers' business. This is business to be shared. And finally, students are equipped for the future, not primarily through acquiring specific knowledge and skills, very, very important specific knowledge or skills, but that's not what primarily equips them, but through their capacity to make informed decisions through their own practice. They must be able to continue to learn through making judgments about their own work and adjusting their learning and adjusting what they draw upon accordingly. So thank you for letting me have this little excursion through things assessment, and I'd be very happy to have some discussion and respond to questions. Thanks very much, Pam.